Episode 55, Blue Zone's founder and longevity explorer, Dan Buettner. Welcome to The Art of Excellence, a show about people doing extraordinary things in their lives. I'm your host, Glenn Zweig. Thanks for joining me. My guest today is Dan Buettner. Dan is an explorer, National Geographic Fellow, award-winning journalist and producer, and a New York Times bestselling author. He discovered the 5 places in the world dubbed Blue Zones where people live the longest, healthiest lives. He is the founder of Blue Zones, a company that puts the world's best practices in longevity and well-being to work in people's lives. He has written a number of New York Times best-selling books, with the latest one titled The Blue Zone's Kitchen, 100 Recipes to Live to 100. Well, Dan, welcome to the show.
Delighted to be here.
Not as much as I am.
Careful, I'm better in print.
Dan, I'm always fascinated with people's backstories, and I'm really curious what yours is. So for starters, why have you devoted your life to studying and teaching healthy living? Like, was health and wellness always important to you?
Well, I should put a finer point on it. I haven't dedicated my life to health and wellness. I'm actually an explorer. And I usually find people who tell you that it's their life mission to make America a healthier place. They usually have their hand in your pocket and are interested in profiting somehow. I actually come to this by way of an explorer and investigative journalist. My immediate background has been solving scientific mysteries for National Geographic. And I've done a series of them, including the collapse of the Maya civilization, human origins of Western civilization, and stumbled upon this interesting mystery of longevity. I found a report from the World Health Organization in the year 2000 that showed Okinawa had the longest disability-free life expectancy in the world. And I said, aha, that's a good mystery. And I just went about unraveling that mystery.
So health is just essentially the latest mystery that you're unraveling here, as opposed to, an anchor that you've now dropped in.
Well, it's been a 15-year-long mystery. I mean, I personally, like you, got romanced by this line of inquiry and wanted to apply it to my own life. But the difference between me and Dr. Oz or something like that is I don't set myself out there as a health guru. I have identified and studied the world's longest lived people, and I can say with some confidence I know their lifestyle better than anybody else. And the essence of the Blue Zone message is, here are the longest lived people, and here's what they've done. And if you want to live longer, there might be some useful lessons in that for you. And I try to convey that in story-driven science or, in some cases, prescriptives.
So at what point, if you go back to your early childhood through school, what was the inflection point, perhaps? Because I assume, or maybe you can correct me, I assume when you were, 10 years old, 12 years old, you didn't say, I'm going to grow up to be an explorer and use that as a launching point for a career. Something happened along the way that you discovered, that you sort of chased this fascination of yours and turned it into a career. How did that happen?
Well, you put your finger on it. I've chased fascinations, and those fascinations have morphed and evolved over time. But I never said to myself when I was 5, I'm going to be an explorer, or I'm going to unravel the secret of longevity. But I did have the great advantage of a father, Roger Buettner, who, instead of taking us to Disney World when we were kids, he'd take us into the North Woods for weeks at a time, where we had to learn how to survive and self-reliance, and learn how to interact with nature and endure hardships and fast and be curious and solve problems. And that morphed into when I was in high school selling newspaper subscriptions, which took me to places like Africa and the Caribbean, and then eventually college, year in Spain, and then I hold 3 world records for bicycling across 6 continents. And so it's just little by little I came to this career of being an explorer.
Yeah, actually, I was going to ask you about that. So, these ultra endurance bike expeditions you've done, cycling from Alaska to Argentina, 13,000 miles around the world, across the continent of Africa. So, was this exploring the world, as you put it? Was it about pushing boundaries physically? Was it about wanting to set some records for the fun of it? Like, what was the motivation from those?
Well, I'm going to steal the phrase you used. It was chasing fascinations for the most part. When you bike across Africa, which occasions having to cross the Sahara Desert unsupported, and crossing the Congo, where this is an area that half the size of the continental United States, and it has 120 miles of roads. It's an activity more akin to playing a 10-month chess game than it is to an endurance sport, because you're every day you're using your brain to strategize survival. But I found myself at age 24 with this protean appetite for learning about the world, and curiosity, and no real financial means. And I learned actually from my mentor, George Plimpton, and a guy named Ramar Sutton. Those guys taught me that if you can sort of pull yourself out of your personal dream and create something that inspires others, if you could set a Guinness World Record, that would interest sponsors. Sponsors are interested in being involved with feats that are media worthy. You can often get them to help, pay for your trip. Very few people want to give you money to go fulfill your personal dream. Setting world records was more of a vehicle to fund my addiction to fascination, or my zeal for fascination, I would say. But it turns out it gives you the tools to be very good at more scientific exploration, because you have to develop a lot of patience. You have to be strategically prepared. You have to know how to network with experts, whether it's finding someone who can help you plan to get across 1,100 miles of sand on a bicycle, or how to come up with a protocol for determining the common denominators of longevity. It's the same skill set. So it incrementally builds, is my point. Little by little, you sort of discern a path, and you take a step, and another step, and pretty soon 10 steps down the path, you can discern the next 10 steps.
Well, like you said, you had set off on this trek to discover these hot spots of longevity around the world. And you found these 5 areas of not just high concentrations of 100-year-olds, but populations with minimal diseases like heart problems, cancer, diabetes. And you coined these blue zones. So these 5 pockets, and I'm going to butcher almost all the names, so help me out here. Is it Icaria, Greece? Icaria?
Americans say Icaria, they say Icaria. You get a high five on that one.
Okinawa, Japan. Sardinia, what do you call that region?
The Nuoro province.
Okay. Loma Linda, California. And then in Costa Rica, what was that peninsula?
The Nicoya Peninsula.
Nicoya. So I guess for starters, anything surprise you about that list of those 5? Anyone that you would have thought would be on that wasn't, or that is on that you wouldn't have expected it?
The most counterintuitive of the 5 is Loma Linda, California, because to get there from Los Angeles, it's about an hour and a half drive down a 6-lane highway under a cloud of smog. You exit at the Loma Linda exit, and the first thing you see in this American blue zone is a Wiener hut and a Del Taco. And it's like, wait, this is blue zone? But, specifically the blue zone is really among the Seventh-day Adventists, the highest concentration of whom live in Loma Linda, California. That's why we chose it. It's not so much a geographic blue zone as it is a cultural sort of subculture blue zone.
And so, I mean, just to take that one, what is it about Seventh day Adventists, about their spiritual philosophy, their lifestyle that would have such a dramatic effect on mortality?
They do a few things. As you well know, stress will shave years off your life expectancy. And I think stress is part of the human condition, whether you live here or in Sardinia. But the Adventists take this idea of Sabbath very seriously. So they work very hard, but come Friday night, no matter what the job's telling them to do, no matter where the kids need to be driven, no matter what the social schedule says, they say no. They eat Friday dinner with their family, no TV. They go to bed early. They wake up Saturday. They go to church, long ceremony. Saturday lunch, they're eating with their friends, very social potlucks. And the hardwired right in their religion is a nature walk every Saturday afternoon. And this goes right through till sunset on Saturday. So they have what they call a sanctuary in time, which is this wonderful opportunity to downshift and to let some of those stress hormones that we might not otherwise let settle. They also take their diet directly from the Bible, Genesis chapter 1, verse 29. Every tree that bears fruit and every plant that bears seed. So they're mostly vegetarian. And the Adventists, because of this Sabbath, they tend to hang out with other Adventists. So we now know that your health behaviors are measurably contagious, and the contagions that circulate through Adventist networks tend to be positive. You'd be hard pressed to find an Adventist who smokes a bong or does shots of tequila on Friday night. So because Adventists hang out with other Adventists, they're planning their plant-based potluck or their Saturday afternoon walk or their spiritual life. It's not for everybody, but it does demonstrate that there is a set of factors that we know are leading to higher life expectancy. To add something to what you said, blue zones aren't necessarily places with high concentrations of centenarians. The definition is they're statistically longest lived, and that's measured by three things: a middle-age mortality, which is essentially your chance of reaching a healthy age 90, low chronic disease. Chronic disease is what kills most Americans, or centenarian rate. That's the high percentage of centenarians. So all blue zones possess one or more of those characteristics.
Well, so you identified these 9 strikingly similar practices and habits across these blue zones because you wanted to find, patterns, right? Points of commonality. So I'm going to just go through the list, but then I'd like you then to just to give a quick snapshot as to what each of these are. Move naturally. What are we talking? Just walking?
Well, I believe Americans are deluded into thinking they can sit in their office 8 hours a day or at home and make up for it at the gym 2 or 3 nights a week. That's not the way we evolved. If you look at the way people in blue zones are doing physical activity, it's never exercise as we think of exercise. This intentional, I'm going to go get a half makeup for sitting around. They're nudged into movement every 20 minutes. So yes, they live in places where every time they go to work or a friend's house or out to eat, and occasions a walk, they have gardens out back. So they're spending an hour or so in this very natural range of motion activity. They haven't engineered physical activity out of their lives with every mechanical convenience imaginable. So they're still doing yard work by hand. They're still kneading bread in the kitchen or grinding corn or sweeping the floor themselves. So there's if you engineer back all the physical activity into our lives that our grandparents did, you don't need to go to the gym. And in fact, when you're 80, 90, or 100, this sort of natural movement is far better for you than trying to run marathons or push around dumbbells at the gym.
Okay, purpose.
So people who know their sense of purpose live about 8 years longer than people who are rudderless. And that's been well established, increasingly salient in health messaging today. In blue zones, people have vocabulary for purpose. Okinawa has the word ikigai, reason for which I wake up in the morning. The Costa Ricans have plan de vida. But the point is, they don't wake up in the morning wondering what their life is all about. They're there for their family, they're there for their island, they're there for their community, they're there for the younger generation, and that's what keeps them taking their medicines, staying active, eating the right food, staying engaged socially, and it's a real important concept.
It's interesting just to isolate purpose. Why do you suppose that has an effect on longevity?
Well, there's existential stress to not knowing what the hell you're doing on this planet. If you wake up every morning and say, what's my worth? Well, what should I do today? It's triggers inflammatory response, but I think it's more about, and there may be some psychosomatic impact of being clueless with your life. But as I was starting to say before, it's the other thing is people who are get up in the morning with pep and vigor and I know what I'm doing today, they have a reason to do all the other things that keep us healthy, like taking their medicines and moving around, getting exercise, eating right. The big point I make about blue zones is none of these nine factors, and we can unpack them more if you want, but I'll just jump to the bottom line now. None of these things survive in isolation for very long. If you look at the recidivism curves or the duration of diets and exercise programs and even taking supplements, people will stay on them or focus for maybe a year or two. When it comes to longevity, you have to do the right things for long enough and avoid the wrong things for decades so you don't develop heart disease or cancer, or diabetes or dementia. Because the Blue Zone brand of longevity is not about extending the capacity of the human machine, somehow changing our genetic code or the buildup of cellular damage, which occurs naturally with time. It's really about avoiding the diseases that foreshorten our lives. And these chronic diseases that will kill the vast majority of people in the first world. Right now, about 70% of everybody on Earth, in fact, is predicted to die of a chronic disease. And in our country, it's driving 85% of our healthcare costs. So what we're talking about is a set of mutually supporting, synergistic factors that help people keep doing the right things for long enough to avoid the wrong thing. I'll just add one more thing quickly. If you have a strong sense of purpose, it's a lot easier to eat a plant-based diet because you might be tempted by that greasy steak or that hamburger. But if you know you need to be around on this world to make sure your kids do well, or you're on fire to fight poverty or whatever it is, you're more likely to do the inconvenient thing for long enough to be around for 90 or 100 years.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. They all go together synergistically. But just for the sake of again, grounding yourselves in the research, give me the quick 20, 30 seconds for the others. So downshift, what is that?
Sacred daily rituals to relieve the stress of everyday life. So the Adventists pray, the Okinawans have ancestor veneration, the Icarians and Costa Ricans take a nap, and Sardinians do happy hour. So just some time. The plant slant, I wrote another book called The Blue Zone Solution, but we did a meta-analysis. So we looked at the dietary surveys for the past 100 years in all 5 blue zones. And overwhelmingly, 95% of their dietary intakes comes from plant-based whole foods. It's simple as that. Meat is eaten, but it's a celebratory food. They tend to drink a little bit of wine, a couple glasses a day. They have strategies to keep from overeating. Breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, and dinner like a pauper. And they're leaving their digestive systems to rest for 14 hours a day. They put their family first. What I mean by this is they take care of their aging parents. They commit to their partners in life. They make their kids a priority. They tend to belong to a faith. People who belong to a religion live about 4 to 14 years longer than people who don't. And they surround themselves with the right kind of people. They're socially committed to a handful of people who help support the right behaviors and stave off loneliness, which we now know is as bad for you as a smoking habit.
So, Dan, I find the research absolutely fascinating, but allow me, if you could, just to play devil's advocate for one or two questions here.
You can play it for the rest of the
No,
podcast.
no, 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 no. So, aside from Loma Linda, which, like you said, was more about a religious, commonality than it is a geographic one. But with the others, did you look into genetics? Did you look at the DNA of the populations? Could that, by any chance, explain any of the resistance to disease and the longer lifespans?
There may be a weak genetic argument for Sardinia because they're a little bit more genetically related, pure. But all of the blue zones are genetically heterogeneous. In other words, they're melting pots. So they don't possess any genes more specific than people in Atlantic. Now, Nicoya, for example, is a melting pot of Africans, of Spanish, and of Mesoamericans. The Okinawans have been a big trading center since the 16th century, and they draw their nationality from the Japanese and what is today Taiwan and farther Southeast Asia. Ikaria similarly is the Turks and the classic Greeks, but also in the 1940s there was a huge influx of people from the rest of Europe. It was a place where they sent communists, kind of an Alcatraz for communists. So no, there's not a genetic argument. Only about 20% of how long the average person lives is dictated by genes. The other 80% is lifestyle and environment. So we're not talking about a genetic story here.
Yep, makes sense. So you came up with these Blue Zones food guidelines based on all this research. Lots of vegetables, beans, nuts, water, cut back on the meat, sugar, dairy, and eggs. Some sort of derivation, permutation of paleo and Mediterranean and some other things out there. But the other thing I thought was really interesting is that you noticed that people in the blue zones consume about 20% fewer calories than the average American does. So I was wondering, could the caloric restriction be as important as, all the different food groups that, really just comes down to learning how to eat less quantity of whatever we're already eating? Could that be a big part of it?
There was episodic periods of caloric restriction in most blue zones, but certainly today they don't eat any fewer calories than we do. Yes, I do believe caloric restriction works. I think the average American consumes about 300 calories more than we should. And there, a few things you see in the blue zones that we can learn from to cut down the number of calories we take in a day. Huge breakfast, try to get all the calories in a 10-hour window. Take the TV out of the kitchen so you're not eating to your favorite television program. The Okinawans have this 2,500-year-old Confucian adage, hara hachibu, which they intone before every meal to remind them to stop eating when their stomachs are 80% full. They tend to eat off of smaller plates, which has some evidence to suggest you eat less. They eat with their family, say a prayer before. There's a number of tricks to keep from overeating, but it's intuitive perhaps to you because you're smart. But to the average American, it's not intuitive at all. The average American eats 207 pounds of meat per year. We consume 55 gallons of soda pops on average. We eat a diet vastly different. We work on average 45 hours a week. The things I point out in blue zones might have reflected more the way our great grandparents ate. But I think it's important to realize that in blue zones, it's mostly plant-based whole food. Meats 5 times per month. If you're eating a handful of nuts a day, it's probably worth 2 years of extra life expectancy. If you're eating a cup of beans a day, it's probably worth 4 years of extra life expectancy. Whole grains, there's all this gluten nonsense. Yes, if you eat refined white flour and if you're celiac, gluten's a big problem. But if you're eating whole grain corn or whole grain rice or whole grain oats, like they were in the blue zones, simple peasant food, first of all, it's cheap. bust the myth that you have to be rich to eat healthy. And number two, rather than some hypey diet, and I'm not a big fan of paleo, I think it's confusing. I love the Mediterranean diet. I hate the keto. Rather than some fad that comes out of a doctor's office who lives in South Beach, this really reflects some solid epidemiology work, what the people who've lived the outcome most of us want. They've lived a long, healthy life and avoided disease, and this is exactly what they've been eating for the past 100 years. That, I think, points us in a pretty strong direction on what we ought to think about doing.
So I want to talk about the fact that, and I guess we could question whether those that don't partake in these healthy choices, whether it's not knowing or not caring, not having willpower. Something you said I found really interesting here is that if you're overweight, it's probably not your fault. That the lack of discipline that I'm alluding to is not the reason for the weight issues, and it's more to do with the environment. It's what we're surrounded by. It's this built environment with the fatty and the sugary and the salty foods just so readily available. So I completely get how the easy availability of high fat and high sugary foods and this whole modern sedentary lifestyle you talked about earlier, how that certainly makes healthy living a lot more challenging. But does individual responsibility not factor in at all?
I can tell you that people in the blue zones possess no more individual responsibility than the average person living in urban Atlanta or suburban Columbus, Ohio. They're no different than they are. They don't have diets or exercise programs. And in fact, the big epiphany of blue zones is these people are not living a longer life because they've proactively pursued health. The big aha is they are living a longer life because they lived in the right environment, and the right daily behaviors have ensued from that right environment. And most of this sort of finger wagging at individuals to you need to take responsibility for your own health and eat right and get enough exercise, and then you unleash people in America. The number of fast food restaurants since the 1980s has gone up by a factor of 30. 48% of all retail outlets, including pharmacies and the place you get your tires changed and your oil in your car changed, serve junk food. You can't escape it. So, how are you going to tell a welfare mother living in Iowa with 3 kids with $400 in a bank account, savings, to go out and make healthy choices when 97 out of 100 choices she's confronted with are bad? So it's so clear in blue zones. And by the way, since I've identified these blue zones, the American food culture has come, and you see Kentucky Fried Chicken and KFC and Burger King and sodas pop up like weeds. And as soon as it happens, their longevity plummets and their chronic disease soars. So it is as clear as the nose in my face that what produces health or lack thereof is a function not of behavior modification, which is a big industry in this country. It's a function of the environment we live in.
And so I guess that explains, because what you did is you took a lot of this research and instead of leveraging all of this work, this body of work, to shift individual behavior, you instead chose to focus at the community level. Right? I think that's what you're speaking to, which is too hard, I assume, too difficult to change individual behavior. Therefore, if we change the environment, it will make it easier for people to do the right thing. Is that the essence of it?
So that my business now is I have a team of almost 200 people who work in 50 cities, and we help cities change the defaults so you set people up for success with their health rather than failure. Let me give you just a few examples that may help illustrate it.
Yes.
If you live in a neighborhood where there are more than 6 fast food restaurants within a half mile of your house, you are about 35% more likely to be obese. And then if you live in a neighborhood where there are fewer than 3 fast food restaurants within a half mile. If you live in a neighborhood where there are billboard signs that advertise junk food, you're about 10% more likely to be obese than the same neighborhood that prohibits billboards. If you live in a neighborhood where it's cul-de-sacs, no sidewalks, and the only way to get to the nearest place to gather is by your car, you're getting on average about 25% less physical activity than the same person living in a neighborhood with sidewalks, bike lanes, access to parks, and access to public transportation. None of the crap that we're marketing, CrossFit or yoga classes or ab masters or ellipticals in our basement or Nutri-drinks or power superfoods or supplement, you leave all that stuff aside. Environment more dependably, more measurably, more with greater longevity will impact populations' health than anything you could sell them.
So what are you actually doing in these communities? Because I assume you got to get a lot of buy-in from government. There's probably a lot of resistance from these big corporations that have all of these, fast food restaurants and everything else.
Actually, we're finding big corporations supporting it. So the approach with these Blue Zone projects is we audition cities. They come to us. They've heard about us from a variety of different outlets. And we spend 6 months with the public sector, the city manager, the city planner, the chamber of commerce, the mayor, city council. And we basically say we have these menus of policy for built environment, for food, for curbing junk food advertising, for denormalizing tobacco. And they're evidence-based. And we say, we're going to be coming in here trying to get consensus around a handful of these policies. Is this something you can sign up for? And if they're shaking their head yes, we then talk to the insurance company, the hospital systems, and they're usually funding these things for us. We're usually in these cities for 5 years, and I have 3 teams. One team helps get consensus and gets healthy policies passed. That's the most cost-effective way to make a population healthier. The second team administers a Blue Zone certification program for schools, restaurants, grocery stores, workplaces, and churches. And they got 5 years to get 30% of all those places certified. And that makes that area 20%, those places 20% healthier. And then I have a third team whose job it is to get to 15% of the adult population to take a Blue Zone pledge, wherein they upgrade their social circle of friends, make sure they have some healthy friends who are eating plant-based and walking together. They take a purpose workshop and volunteer, and they take our checklists into their homes to change the defaults in their kitchens and their bedrooms and the rest of their homes, so they're nudged into moving more and eating less. And when you orchestrate this perfect storm of people, places, and policies, unleashing a swarm of healthy nudges and defaults for 5 years, in almost every case, we see the obesity rate drop and we see the life satisfaction, as measured by Gallup, improve. It works.
I guess it'll be such a longitudinal study to know the ultimate impact on longevity, right?
Well, you can predict that ahead of time. There's all kinds of, so you take Fort Worth, Texas. We've been working in Fort Worth for 5 years. The BMI of Fort Worth has gone down by 6%. The smoking rate's gone down by 3%. So in a population of nearly 1 million, you can very easily calculate that about 1,900 fewer people will die of lung cancer. You'll get probably 30,000 fewer heart attacks over time by lowering those numbers. And with that, you can, therefore, because these deaths didn't happen, you can calculate the bump in life expectancy. Life expectancy is not necessarily the end goal, but the immediate goal is to lessen the chronic disease load today. So we're not squandering all this money on avoidable diseases. And you're feeling better. And, you don't lose your dad to a heart attack because he mindlessly ate better.
Well, I know each of these communities is unique. If you look across all of them and you make these changes, what are one or two greatest challenges that you encounter from these makeovers?
If it's a city of resistance, we say no. We say no all the time to cities. We just turned Dallas down because we didn't think they were ready, even though they're right next to Fort Worth.
I guess shift it more around individual behavior, right? You want people eating better. You want them moving more. You want them, upgrading their social networks. You want them, just really changing their whole life around. So if you look across all of these behavioral shifts, and like you said before, they have to happen, they're very synergistic. So you really need all of them to happen. Do you find that one or two of those is much harder from an individual behavioral change perspective?
So I know this is disruptive, but I don't believe behavior change works. If you want to live longer, don't waste your time trying to change your behavior. Every year, a huge proportion of Americans have a New Year's resolution, and by February 18th, 90% of them are no longer doing it. We have to sort of drop this delusion that we're going to have the necessary focus and discipline to modify our behavior for long enough to make a difference. Single-digit percentages of people can do that, but the vast majority of Americans, not going to happen. The challenge for people is to accept the fact that most of your health and indeed your happiness is driven by the ecosystem around you. So rather than spending a bunch of money on a diet program or some drink or an expensive gym membership, taking the time to really carefully curate a half a dozen friends whose idea of recreation is playing tennis or walking or whatever, bicycling. Because then when you hang out with them, instead of sitting around watching TV, you're going to be moving. It's a good idea to make friends with a vegetarian or vegan. So they're nudging you away from your meat habit. They tend to eat healthy. And when you're with them, you're going to have to serve them their food, and therefore you might eat it and go to restaurants where, that actually looks good. Friends who care about you on a bad day. That's what works. Friends are long-term adventures. Getting really clear on your sense of purpose. Most people just careen through life. They go to school, they get a college education. Now they're in debt. I got to make money to pay off that debt. I don't really like my job. By the way, only 30% of Americans like their job. With strong indication that people aren't following their purpose, their sense of purpose in life. Setting up your house. In Blue Zone's kitchen, I offer several suggestions on how to set up your kitchen so you're less likely to eat mindlessly and more likely to eat healthy food. So shifting the focus away from behavior modification, it works for single-digit percentages for long term, to shaping your environment so the healthy choice is mindless or easy.
Yeah. Talk about some of those ways to shift your kitchen to make it easier.
Well, I rely on my good buddy, Brian Wansing from Cornell, who's done very good research. If you take your toaster off of your kitchen counter, you're less prompted to put something unhealthy in there. If you have a high quality fruit bowl, well lit, it reminds you to keep it full. And if it keeps you full, that's fruit's default. You have a junk food drawer that's out of the way in a pantry or down low. You don't keep it on a clip on the counter because, most of us are on seafood diets. We eat the food we eat. For Blue Zones, people in our Blue Zone cities, we ask them to we have this magnet, or you can just do a Post-it note that you put on your refrigerator, the 4 foods to always have on hand and the 4 foods to never have in your house. I'm not saying don't eat them. The 4 foods to always have on hand are nuts, vegetables you like. I don't care what kind of vegetables they are. Whole grain, 100% whole grain bread. We tend to eat sandwiches, and beans. The savior of the American diet, mark my words, is going to be beans in some form or another. And then the 4 foods to never have in your house are processed meats. They're the same level of carcinogenic as smoking, according to the World Health Organization. Soda pops, number 1 source of refined sugar in the American diet. Salty snacks and packaged sweets. So I'm not saying you shouldn't treat yourself once in a while when you go out, but if you have them around your house, you're going to eat them. and you can shape your food environment. It's easy enough to shape your food environment. It doesn't take any discipline if you don't have sweets and snacks around the house to not eat them. So that's sort of the blue zone approach as opposed to, behavior modification.
When you went through all of this and came up with all of these insights and findings, I'm curious what changed in your personal life.
Yes, I've become vegetarian, vegan, somewhere in between the two. It's so clear to me that if you're eating meat, you're doubling or tripling your chance of heart disease, diabetes, and many kinds of cancer. So I've cut that out. But the way I've done it is I hang out with vegans. It makes it really easy. Plus, all the best restaurants in LA these days are vegan. I've gotten really clear on my sense of purpose. So I don't. It's very hard to get me to do something that isn't in the center of the bullseye of my particular ikigai. I've really, I haven't dumped old friends who were influencing me the wrong way, but I see them a heck of a lot less. And I very proactively have gotten people around my life that nudge me in the right way. I like to bike, so I have a lot of bicycle. I'm going biking with 10 friends in Vietnam next month. And I've really made it a point to, there's these people in your life who you call them and you never hear back from. The people I hang out with now are the people who I can call on a bad day and they'll care. And I've been really intentional about shaping my social environment. And I'm naturally a social guy, and I used to subdue that. Now I just let it rip. As soon as we get done here, I'm going to happy hour.
Yeah, but I don't like to stand between my guest and happy hour. That's for sure. How many of these communities are you making over with this Blue Zones right now, roughly speaking, or have?
Well, we've done 50. It's usually a 5-year engagement. We've been at it 11 years. But actively, the big cities are Fort Worth, Texas, Naples, Florida, Orlando, and Jacksonville, Florida just came on board. The whole island of Hawaii. I would say those are our big ones right now.
And if you had to guesstimate how many people throughout these communities have improved their health thanks to these makeovers, what are we talking about?
5 to 6 million.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So you just have to realize that we're not trying to get one person to add 10 years to their life expectancy. We're trying to get 900,000 people to add 9 months to their life expectancy. And when you add that up, the impact is enormous.
Do you have like an ultimate destination with this? Are you taking this across the globe? Are you focused all on the United States right now? How far do you want to take this business?
Well, as you know, we started with this wonderful conversation about this idea of chasing your fascination. I just chased my fascination incrementally. I started out as an explorer, and now I have this big company, and it's fascinating to be an innovator. You can try things and triage them pretty quickly, but when you have to operate in a couple dozen cities nationwide, you have to scale, and how you build a culture that's at once, and scaling and innovating are diametrically opposed. Operators like to lock down a process and do it over and over again. Innovators try new shit and then they get rid of what doesn't work. So I'm fascinating with building a culture that can do that right now, and I'm in a position. I get to hire the best food policy and built environment policy and tobacco policies in the world. And I'm infinitely interested in that right now. And I get to bring them on my team and work with them all the time. And that's, I figure if I just get good at what's in front of me, the success will continue to come.
Well, it's interesting because I don't know you all that well, but this notion that you really started out in life as an explorer, you wanted to unlock mysteries. And don't get me wrong, I realize there's a lot of road in front of you with this, but you've unlocked it. I mean, you're getting millions and millions of people on a healthy track. And I would think you'd be somewhere where once you've done that, let someone else go run it, and then you're off to the next mystery to unlock. But you really want to stay with this, it sounds like.
Yeah, so I'm going to stay. I mean, this is my legacy, but operating a company well is an adventure right now. It's, I have a CEO that runs it, on the day-to-day basis. But he and I are connected at the hip, and he's busy doing the day-to-day operations, and I'm busy with this bigger picture, which is an adventure for me. I suspect in 9 months or something we'll have this squared away, and it'll be on to the next facet of the adventure.
Yeah.
I don't know what it's going to be yet, but
Yep.
it'll be
Yeah.
cool.
Final question here, and then you're off to happy hour. The name of the podcast, Dan, is The Art of Excellence. I always like to hear how my guests define the word excellence.
It means having a very clear idea what your personal passions are, what you're good at, and having an outlet to do it every day for most of your life.
An excellent answer. I love it. Dan, I cannot thank you enough.
It was I wish the two of us could sit down and have an adult beverage together and be in the same room.
I would love it. I honestly would love it. Hey, thanks for listening. Okay, don't go yet, please. 2 favors. I ask simply 2 favors. One, if you could please download the iTunes app. You could do it on your phone. You can do it on the computer. Take 60 seconds and leave a review. It means a lot. 2, you can find my episodes on several social media sites, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. Find the one that you like the most. Find the one where you tend to have a lot of friends and followers. And if you could please either share it in the case of Facebook and LinkedIn, or retweet it on Twitter, that would mean the world to me. So those are the 2 asks I have. I love putting together this podcast. I hope you enjoy listening to it. Thank you so much, and I will see you again next time. Bye-bye.